In this module on discrimination in the workplace, I'd like to begin to look at some pay differential statistics. First, let's talk about a statistic that we often hear, but we actually find is a little too general for us to discuss and look at graphics on. That statistic is that the difference between male and female incomes in the United States is about a 74% ratio. That means if we compare female wages to male wages, that females on average make about 74% of the amount of money that on average a male makes. Now, this figure is a little bit misleading. It doesn't mean that there's not a problem here. Please don't misunderstand me. But the figure itself is a little bit misleading. That does not mean that a female doing the exact same job with the exact same skills as a male earns 74% of that which the male earns. It means on average, if we take the earnings of all females in the U.S. labor market, comparing them to the earnings of all males in the U.S. labor market, on a per person basis, that the females earn about 74% of that which the males earn. Well, what might we be able to attribute this to? Well, as we look at it specifically, we find that some of this is because of the jobs that females have gravitated towards versus the jobs that males have gravitated towards. This might be a function or a reflection of the occupational discrimination that we pointed out in the prior segment, or it simply may be a function of some social norms or some path dependencies, or a function of some expectations that our society has created that males and females have gravitated towards. Is that express discrimination, or is that somewhat structural and systemic issues that simply fall under the larger heading of a discriminatory practice, but may not be motivated by express discriminatory expectations and beliefs or actions on the part of employers or employees? It's difficult to say. When we do break this down, though, we find that on average, a male and a female holding the same job with the same required skill sets, same demands, the female will earn about 94% of that which the male earns. Well, it's difficult to ascribe that 6% pay differential to anything but discrimination. So while the 74% number is an accurate number, and it is the number that's most often touted, it's not a number that means what we often hear it to mean. It does not mean that there is a 26% pay differential representative of some express discrimination. The 94% figure, on the other hand, is representative of some express discrimination. So let's look at a little bit different at some pay differential statistics, and in this case we'll look at differences by race. We see in this category, race and gender. We see in this graphic that I have here for you that female earnings in the whole were $29,215 for this particular year. This is 2013, by the way. Male earnings were $38,275. This would be an average earning for male workers versus average earnings for female workers. And we saw that the female ratio was at 76.3% of the male ratio. So what we've done is we've taken the wage for the female and the wage for the male and identified a 76.3% ratio. When we look at that same metric for whites, rather than the entire population, we find that that ratio actually reduces to 75.1, which is not a betterment, of course. That the ratio is worse. When we look at blacks, this is interesting. There is less of a male-female disparity in wages amongst blacks in our economy. We find that the females are earning $26,595 on average, where a male earns $31,351, or for a ratio of 84.8%. Now that seems like it's much better. However, contrast a few things here. Look at the difference between black male wages and white male wages, black female wages and white female wages. So there's another ratio that we might be concerned about here that's not expressed in these values on the right-hand side of this graphic. We see yet disparities still when we think of the wages of Hispanic females and Hispanic males. We see an 85.7% ratio. And as this ratio gets bigger, it means that there's less and less disparity between the wages of one group, females, versus the wages of the males. But once again, I think we need to consider the difference in wages between the Hispanic females and white females, Hispanic males and white males. When we look at Pacific Islanders, we actually see the greatest disparity of all. And we see some relatively high wages. These are actually Asians and Pacific Islanders, which is part of why we see relatively high wages. When we break this out to just Asians alone, we see that Asians tend to make more on average, but also have more male-female disparity on average than any other group within our society. And that might be interesting as to why there's more male-female disparity there. We might recognize that in most Asian cultures, the roles of males and roles of females are well described, well defined, and have been that way not only for generations, but for literally hundreds of years, and it's become very difficult to break those. Well, when we see that the ratio is worse amongst that group than any other particular segment of our society. But in this case, we also see that Asian and Pacific Islander females tend to make more than white females. Asian and Pacific Islander males tend to make more than white males. So these are just a couple of race and gender differences on pay statistics. Now let's think about the male-female median annual earnings over time for U.S. workers, full-time workers. So what we're looking at on the x-axis is time, 1960 through 2000 and about 2005 in this case. And on the y-axis, we're looking at this ratio, and we're seeing it on a constrained bound here. We only show at the minimum here 50% and at the top an 85%. So we're not looking at 0 to 100. If we did, it would simply expand the graphic for us, and there wouldn't be any new information in that expanded area, so it's constrained here for us. But we see over time that from 1960 to 1970, even though we had some downward periods and some upswings, downward and upswings, there was roughly flat. We stayed in 52, 54, 55% ratio, which represented a fairly significant gap between male and female earnings. Which gap now, if this is for all male and female workers in the United States, that gap today has settled in at closer to 76%. I gave you a number of 74% in an earlier part of this conversation, but that was a breakdown of a slightly different part of or a slightly different breakdown within society. But we see that this value started out at about 55%, stays roughly close to that, a little bit under for the 1960s into 1970s. It dips to a low of about 52% in about 1975, but then begins an upward trend over a period of years that is unmistakable. And we have to think about what is causing this upward trend. This is not simply a byproduct of more females entering the workplace, although we absolutely have had that. Thinking back to our conversation on the labor force and labor force participation rates. But this is a function of greater opportunities for females in the workplace. This is a function of breaking of historic social norms. This is a function of better educational opportunities for females. And we then begin to see that those educational opportunities turn into greater productivity, turn into greater income opportunities for females. So this trend line is not simply a breakdown in discrimination in the workplace itself. This trend line is a breakdown in terms of no longer differentiating workers and learners by gender as much as we did for generations in this country, but treating those workers and earners more homogeneously and then seeing the productivity outcomes of those, such that by the time we hit 2005 or so, we end up at only the 75, 76, 77% differentiation. Some of this is an issue of lessening of discrimination and actual workplace discrimination or wage discrimination. Some of this is a relaxing of occupational norms. Some of this is a crossing over imagined barriers that had been there. For example, my oldest daughter is an attorney in San Diego. Extraordinarily proud of her. My youngest daughter seeks to be an attorney. Well, 20, 30, 50 years ago, the opportunity for those two very bright, very capable young women to become a successful attorney would have been significantly limited. Today, there's nothing surprising about having successful female attorneys. In fact, it would be surprising to us to go into a successful law firm and find only males today. We would wonder what's happening in that law firm. As we look a little bit further, let's look at the female and male hourly wage ratios by age group and by year now. So we're looking at 1978, 1988, and 1998, and we're looking at age bands of 18 to 24, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, and 45 to 44. Well, we see that in the earlier decades, in the youngest age group, we went from 82.4% ratio, so females earning 82.4% of what a male earned in that wage group, to 93 to 94%. In the 25 to 34-year-old group, we saw that this disparity is much greater than it is in the younger group. So we started out at 70%, moved up to 82.8, and then up to about 85. The 35 to 44-year-old group is more disparate still. We start out at a value of less than 60%, moved to just a little bit less than 70, and then up to 76.1. And then we have similar disparity, or nearly the same disparity, in the 45 to 54-year-old group at 58, 64.5, and 71.6%. Probably the more important thing to consider here is what drives these differences. Is it, as we have progressed through time, we've become less discriminatory? Well, that appears to be the case. As each one of these categories have improved over time, we would presume there to be less discrimination, and both in terms of workplace discrimination and occupational discrimination, probably also in terms of employee and customer discrimination. But is it simply that? Or how much of this is driven by productivity means? How much of this is because we have provided and motivated better educational opportunities for female learners, which then turn into better productivity and greater opportunities for female workers? It's probably the case. My own mother didn't graduate from high school. My father barely did. He became a construction worker. She was what we would traditionally call a housewife. Her opportunities for learning were insignificant. Her opportunities for productivity outside of the household were insignificant. My father, on the other hand, had a great mind, but didn't have any formal training, and yet went from being a construction worker and a laborer when he was a young man to a general superintendent of a very profitable commercial construction company by the time he retired. He had significant education experiences, but outside of a formal setting, he had on-the-job training, on-the-job experiences that my mother never had the opportunity to have. That would have been a 1960s experience, 1960s and early 1970s experience, so we can see some of those experiences move throughout time. We see that we find the lowest disparity amongst the youngest age group. Part of that is going to be reflected in this educational issue. If education brings about productivity, and I would argue that it does, you would probably argue that it does, then amongst that age group, there is little educational differentiation. 18-year-old females and 18-year-old males probably both had a similar high school experience. It isn't until we get towards the upper end of this young bound, towards into the early 20s, that we see that some people have gone to and graduated from college. Other people have simply participated in some college. Others haven't participated in college at all. So those skill set differentiation, based upon educational opportunities provided, begins to reveal itself, but it really is only prevalent in the older part of this young age grouping, and that's part of why we see not only high percentages here, but we see relatively narrow banding. There is only about a 12% difference between 82% and 94%, whereas we have a 15% difference in the next age banding. We have a 18%, 17% difference in the next age banding, and so on. So as we move through these age groups, we see different wage ratios, and we probably are seeing not only the effects of discrimination through prior decades, but we're seeing the effects of educational opportunities and experiences as well. Let's now look at female and male median annual earnings by education. And this is a study performed in 2001. At the bottom on the x-axis here, we're looking at percentages. So we're looking at the percentage female to male wage in this wage female to wage male metric. And then clearly here on the y-axis, we're seeing some education levels. We see that these are relatively tight in the high school or less than high school graduation to high school graduation to associate degree, and then finally moving upwards to a bachelor's degree. We see that they're relatively tight, going only from 72.4 to 75.1. And we see that number is represented yet again pretty closely to that in the doctorate and the master's degree. So this is telling us that we have somewhere in the low 70% that workers, female workers of any one of these master's, bachelor's, associates, high school graduation, less than high school graduation, and doctorate degree holders, that females have earned approximately 70, 72, 75% of their male counterparts. It's interesting in this professional degree category. This would be not a traditional master's, but it might be an MBA. This would be different certificate programs. This would be those that have received advanced degrees that are industry specific, in which case we're seeing CPAs, attorneys, engineers, and industries that were for generations dominated by males, and even today are largely populated by males. This would be financiers and bankers as well. So some of this tells us a little bit about educational disparities, but there's really not that much disparity amongst most of these education groups. 72.4 to 75.1 is not a big difference in this grouping, but 60.3, that's a big difference. As we work yet a little bit further here, then we can look at the distribution of annual earnings by gender for year-round full-time workers. And we're now looking at this for males and females. We're looking at years of experience here, and we're looking at the incomes, the different incomes on the y-axis, and we're looking at some distribution of earnings on the x-axis. So as we think about this, we find that there's very little distributional inequality for those that earn under $10,000. And males are in the green and females are in the magenta colors here. And in fact, in this case, we find that females tend to have a greater distribution of earnings in this category than males. So at the lowest end of the income spectrum, we see more female earnings than we do male. We see, again, in the $10,000 to $20,000 range, we see that male and female disparity, although it's a much greater distribution. In the $20,000 to $25,000 category, we're once again seeing females, but not quite as dramatically as in the $10,000 to $20,000 category. We see females, though, still with a higher distribution of earnings than for males. That is decreasing yet further by the time we hit the $25,000 to $35,000 category, and it reverses trend by the time we get to the $35,000 to $49,000 or $50,000 category, where finally we have a higher distribution of the earnings amongst males than we do females in this category, which then that trend continues further to a greater disparity in the the $50,000 to $75,000 category, and that trend is most acute within the greater than $75,000 category. I think we have to stop and think about what causes this inflection change here. Why are we seeing us go from greater female distribution to male and then greater male distribution to female, increasingly so as we work up the remainder of the income groups? This would be suggestive of males and females having different occupational choices, having different opportunities provided to them, having different career paths, which is going to be in some respects the function of social norms, but it's also going to be in some respects a function of occupational or statistical discrimination, as we've discussed in the earlier segment. So as we look at this, we have a big, broad, general number that females tend to earn 76 or 74% as much as males do in the U.S. economy. That's a number each of you have probably heard. It's certainly a number that's touted by many within the halls of Congress and many lobbyists. But we find when we actually look at it on a job-by-job basis, on a skill level by skill level basis within the workplace, that differentiation or disparity moves downwards to 96 or 94%. Whereas when we separate this out by age, by income bands, by gender, by race, we see yet other disparities, each one of them suggesting that over time discrimination has improved. However, we still have not gotten to where it needs to go. So we're still not perfect in this case. We have tremendous ground to make still.